Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second FP&A Trends Connect meeting. Thank you for joining us, and we have really a very international audience. So we had registrations from 56 countries this time. The subject of our today's meeting is zero-based budgeting, zero-based budgeting in multinationals. And let me remind you that this is the part one of the two sessions that we are planning for you. The next one will be about zero-based budgeting case study. My name is Larissa Melnichuk, and I'm CEO and founder of FP&A Trends Group and International FP&A Board. And let me remind you that this new project of FP&A Board Connect was just launched on the 29th of April. And the idea is we can't travel the world right now, but we can travel the world digitally. We have chapters in 27 cities, 16 countries around the globe. And we are going to travel with our FP&A board members, with our presenters, with their case studies and thought leadership information. So today, our stop is in London. And we will have presentations from Dubai, in Paris, and Seattle, and Kuala Lumpur, New York, and also Geneva in the coming weeks. This is the agenda today, zero-based budgeting in multinationals. I will give you a quick introduction to zero-based budgeting evolution and latest trends. We had meetings on zero-based budgeting latest trends in 11 cities in different countries around the globe. And I would like very quickly and briefly update you on the latest trends that we see, the collective conclusion from our FP&A board members. And then we will have presentation from Paul Harris, a very experienced commercial finance director on zero-based budgeting in multinationals. We will have opportunities for Q&A session, and I must say that based on your feedback from the last session, we extended this session a little bit, only by 10 minutes, to allow for people to ask more questions. So this session will be altogether 40 minutes. Obviously, those people that plan to be with us only 30 minutes, it's optional to stay the last 10 minutes. Let me introduce our speaker for today. So we have Paul Harris, who is experienced commercial finance director. And Paul is a member of our London FP&A board, but also during Paul's time with Tesla, he was a member of our Amsterdam FP&A board. And actually, the presentation that you're about to hear, it was delivered during our session in Amsterdam. Paul has an amazing portfolio of companies. So he worked for Nike and Apple and Starbucks and Tesla. A lot of experience in zero-based budgeting, but also at different transformational projects, both for finance and FP&A. Paul, welcome to our webinar. Welcome to FP&A Board Connect. Glad to have you here. So let me start to introduce the subject of the latest trends in zero-based budgeting. But before we do this, just a few housekeeping items. So it will be 40 minutes online event. We will have 2 polling questions. We will have 1 Q&A session. You will have opportunity to ask questions via chat box during our Q&A session. Of course, there will be time constraint, but we extended this time. And you will have opportunity to give us your feedback when the webinar is closed. So let us start from the definition of zero-based budgeting. I really like this one, which is coming from Jimmy Carter, 39th president of the US. So during his presidential promise in 1976, he said that if I'm elected president, I'm going to institute zero-based budgeting, which going to evaluate every program every year and eliminate those programs that are obsolete. So I think it's a great definition of zero-based budgeting. So everything is starting from scratch. we forget about the history and we rethink every single item of our income statement, profit and loss account, balance sheet, cash flow. The reality is that it's not about expenses anymore. This is the evolution of zero-based budgeting. So you know that traditional budgeting process, it's 100 years old, over 100 years old. It was introduced by McKinsey, and definitely it was great for that not flexible and very stable environment. But obviously in 70s of last century, things started to be different, and companies started to be careful about cost cutting. So zero-based budgeting was introduced exactly 50 years ago, and it was used for presidential elections. It was used by many companies, mostly for cost cutting. But then zero-based budgeting culture, zero-based culture, how we call this now, or zero-based mindset, it's all about value creation. So we are not looking at zero-based budgeting only as the exercise to cut costs. It's all about value creation, and especially in this incredible environment that we live right now, it will be especially important to look at the values. But obviously, very, very old tradition, very, very old, 50 years old method. But we experienced renaissance of this method in the last 5 to 7 years. And regarding this Accenture survey, the last year survey, 300 large global companies currently use it. But what is interesting, they still continue, majority of them, namely 90% of them, continue to use it mostly to reduce their costs. So this is the timing now to think not only about the cost, but the value add and value creation. This is the conclusion from our 11 FP&A board meetings around the globe. So what is new in zero-based budgeting in the current business environment, and what is the view on zero-based budgeting from FP&A board point of view? So the first one, a very important point, it's applied not only to expenses anymore, and in reality it could be applied to many other items of your profit and loss account and your balance sheet and even cash flow. It's about rethinking your value driver, your business drivers. So this is the method that can help us with the identification of key business drivers. Obviously, the method that will be very useful for driver-based planning. And driver-based planning, this is the basis of modern FP&A flexibility. So it can help us with flexible and dynamic planning process. Because this is collective exercise, it really relies on business partnering, and it really influences the culture. And finally, it removes fat from the budget. You know, it removes all those unnecessary items, and it allows us to reinvest those items into value-adding activities. So those are the conclusions. So we can say that zero-based budgeting really can help with driver-based planning, and through driver-based planning with integrated FP&A and scenario planning and rolling forecast and collaborative planning. It can help with this if we look at a zero-based budgeting culture from the point of view of drivers and value drivers. Before we start, a presentation from Paul. We really would like to hear from you. We would like to have this first polling question. So I'm about to open this polling question right now, and I would like to ask you to vote. So how would you describe your experience with zero-based budgeting? I'm launching the poll right now, and I would like to ask you to start voting. So is it non-existent? Is it theoretical? Is it successful practical experience or unsuccessful practical experience? Please vote. I can see that many of you, more than 40% now, more than 50% now voted, more than 60. So let us move to 70. And I'm closing the poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. So we are sharing the results. And you can see that 21% of you said that it's non-existent. 51 theoretical. Of course, we're all finance people. Interestingly enough, almost quarter of you have successful practical experience. We definitely would like to hear from you. And 4% have unsuccessful practical experience. Paul, I would like to ask you to comment on this. So is it something that surprises you, or is it something that you saw in your companies as well?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's kind of in line with what my expectations would be from that result, given the audience we have here today.
Thank you so much. You know what? It's really consistent with the very similar survey we do at different boards. And as I mentioned to you, we had 11 meetings on 4 continents. So it's very, very consistent. But the reality is that those people that say they have only theoretical experience, at the end of the meeting, very often we discover that people had this experience, but they didn't call this zero-based budgeting. Just remember the time when you had to look at a big cost item and had to identify what are the drivers and not to look at this from the history point of view. So the reality is that probably you didn't call this zero-based budgeting, but it was your zero-based budgeting experience. I'm hiding the results, and I think it's a great opportunity now for Paul to share his experience with us. So Paul Harris, experienced commercial finance director, and the subject is zero-based budgeting in multinationals. Paul, you're welcome. The microphone is yours.
Can you hear me okay? First, let me just double check.
Yes, we can hear you. Please.
Excellent.
You're welcome.
So just briefly introduce myself. As you can see from my history behind me, I've worked at mostly large West Coast American multinational corporations. But apart from the introduction that Larissa has given me, it's worth pointing out that most of these corporations have grown significantly over the time that I was been there. And as such, they continue to transform as they go throughout business. Now, most of my time in these organizations, I've been in the commercial finance space, so always working on budgets, plans, forecasts, assessing return on investment analytics, and deciding where we spend our resources. In most of the corporations I've been at, I've been involved in the finance director role on that front, and I've usually been in a region. I've never really worked in the headquarters on the West Coast of the US. So in Nike, I was in Toronto in Canada, and then in Apple and Starbucks, I was in the UK, and when I was at Tesla, I was in Amsterdam on that front. Now, my general view on this, when I talk to you today about where zero-based budgeting is my probably dislike in the amount of resource that businesses and corporations spend on the planning process itself. I'm a big believer in that Mike Tyson quote, where everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think that's the reason why I quite like zero-based budgeting, but hate the phrase budgeting being associated with that. I love the fact that zero-based budgeting forces people to get grounded in their drivers and get a good understanding of what's driving their costs, but I don't like the fact that it's being associated with the budgeting process. So on that though, let's think about how we can progress into the business. So to be effective, zero-based budgeting needs to take into consideration a number of things. And that's kind of what I'm going to try to bring forward to you today, is some of the things that zero-based budgeting has and what some of the risks that it's going to be associated with as it progresses into the organization. I'm once again talking about from a West Coast standpoint, but I'm happy to kind of address any questions posed as that goes through. So if we can go to the first slide on the changing landscape, please, Larissa. Okay, so if you think about the landscape and as it changes, I've been part of the London FP&A Board for a number of years. And one thing I've always talked about on the planning process is that finance has the ability to work with the business and help them navigate the current landscape. The budgeting process in itself can cause significant amount of stress and change into a business. And really, the landscape we're seeing today, and with the coronavirus itself, is just a great example. But that's just been the latest in terms of some of the other huge global disruptions that we've seen, which include things like Brexit, like terrorist activities, like huge macro politics in terms of, elections and what they mean, and all those things significantly impact business and their ability to create a robust budget within the plans. Zero-based budgeting in the middle of all that can create a significant amount of time, energy, effort, and resource, which would impact the ability of these things to manifest into huge results into the business. And so it could create a bit of a nightmare. The other big things you got to think about is the impact on the longer term. Zero-based budgeting in itself, if not kept in check, can really force businesses to be cutting costs in spite of leading into longer-term growth. And obviously a good example there is with my time at Apple. And if you look to the right there, you can see when I joined Apple, it was right after the iPod launched. You can see that on the chart. And you can see the growth curve that Apple went through during that phase. Now, as a finance director in that corporation, if I turned to the Tim Cooks of the world and said, hey, I'd like to put in zero-based budgeting to help control costs, I would almost be thrown out. But that said, there is a need to understand what's driving the cost and what that means, and looking at cost cutting at the individual regions, departments, or area of the business that you're over-assessing. Now, over time, your business is going to have different competitors. You're going to launch new products, and the landscape is going to continue to change. And so zero-based budgeting needs to be flexible enough to kind of take that into consideration. Also, probably the last thing to think about is internally, the definition of success may change. And so, things like what is defined as good or what is a great investment now may not be the case in the future. And a good example would be something, again, is at Apple, where you're thinking about how it continues to evolve, and we're investing in different parts of the business, such as advertising, as of marketing, or as R&D. Another good example would be when I was at Starbucks, where you're thinking about the changing landscape. When Howard stepped out of being the leader and Kevin moved in, one of his big changes in the macro view for Starbucks was he was going to focus on North America and he was going to focus on China. And all the other regions were going to become part of a streamlined initiative. So then your drivers are going to significantly change. Even though from a financial perspective, it may make sense to invest more resource into driving growth. If it's not aligned to your corporate initiatives, then it's never going to work. And these are things that we should be thinking about as we continue to roll out the business. Okay, if we can move to politics, please. So the other big thing we got to think about, particularly in large multinational corporations, is the politics and the politics that are in place within an organization. One thing that I've seen throughout my years is that typically people stay in a role for somewhere around 2 years. Now that's not uncommon. If you take a look at the chart here that I've seen in Business Insider, that seems to be a par for the course in a lot of large multinational corporations. The problem with that is it kind of reinforces what I've talked about before about the impact of short-term and long-term impacts. A lot of times people could kind of come in, make some calls or some consequences that they're not there to pick up the repercussions of their decisions on. And zero-based budgeting, if left unchecked, can lead to those type of initiatives. I got a seagull there. For those who've worked in large multinationals, you can understand what this means. You have a corporate seagull which flies in, makes a mess of the place, and then leaves. And that's kind of what you don't want to have happening in zero-based budgeting, being a tool for that to come into place. The other big thing, and lastly, is the politics around that. Trying to understand the stories and pull apart what needs to happen, like how good your drivers are, can create a lot of political stories. Everyone's got an example of trying to understand what the benefit or what the value of their costs are, or what their investments are, but there's always a story as to why their cost hasn't worked. This product line would have worked if the advertising would have worked on time, or this product line or this investment would have had a better return if supply chain would have delivered their products like they said they would, but they fell down, and this wouldn't be the case. And so trying to make sure you clearly understand what your drivers are and what their impacts are around that really has a significant impact on their ability to pull the business forward. Okay. We can go to slide 4, please, around the appetite within the business. Now, it's quite critical that the appetite, there is an appetite to implement zero-based budgeting in the business. One of the worst things that could happen is you try to implement a zero-based budgeting initiative through the guise of just a finance-led activity. And that's probably my biggest concern with calling it a zero-based budgeting, being a budget process itself. It should be a zero-based planning or just a mindset change around how the business engages with understanding its costs, and then allows them to kind of engage with the true drivers of driving value into a business. But that said, understanding these costs and understanding these drivers do take a huge investment in time, and that investment needs to be made by the finance, making sure finance is bringing the teams closer together, but also needs to be made by the business themselves. And in a period of time where people are stretched as they are today, that investment could be hard. Additionally, there needs to be investment in training. Bringing people in line with understanding costs and cost drivers is not always the strength of some of your external business partners. And if you're looking at your sales and your marketing guys, trying to get them grounded into some of the numbers and understanding their cost drivers is a bit of a challenge. And you need to make sure that the business is bought off on that to make sure that you understand what that means. And then lastly, looking at costs through the guise of zero-based budgeting kind of sheds a new light on things, and it may cause businesses to pivot in their way that they're looking at the way they run their strategy. And I would say at the companies I've worked for, the company that does zero-based planning better than anyone else would have been Tesla. Elon himself was very hands-on in understanding your costs and making sure we're getting the best return on investment at any given time. The zero-based budgeting approach to P&L maximization was done outside the budgeting cycle and was driven through every aspect of the business, whether it be through sales, through marketing, through service, on the IT spend. Very clear about understanding what those are, what the best return on investments would be, and all employees were encouraged to make sure that they can roll up any sort of ideas they have to kind of drive that through and maximize the P&L budget, P&L profitability. Okay, and lastly, there's the maturity of the FP&A team. Now that to me is probably the most important aspect of how we roll out a zero-based budgeting team. For those who are been part of the FP&A board for a while, you understand what I mean by the maturity of the FP&A team. But those who don't, let me spend a second explaining it. If your team is scorekeepers, if that stereotypical joke of, why did the accountant cross the road? Because they looked in the ledger and that's what they did last year, applies to how your team engages with your business, then that's probably something that you got to think about if you want to implement something as complex as zero-based budgeting. Additionally, if you're still using Excel for your consolidations and you're a large multinational, complex, interdependent organization, it's going to be very difficult to kind of roll that through. And then lastly, probably most importantly, is going to be your business partnering aspect. I'm a big believer in the finance business partners. I think finance sitting out with the business, helping generate true business decision-making in real time has considerable value. And I think this is something that the businesses need to do to make sure that you get zero-based budgeting up and running as it rolls through. So here's so if we go to the next slide, please, Larissa. The key success factors to make zero-based budgeting work is quite important. A clear understanding as to the why and what does that mean is got to be important. A clear understanding of the scope and the implementation is going to be key. You want to make sure that there's enough time set aside to make sure people can put the time, energy, and effort to put in place, and a mature FP&A function is absolutely key. Okay, and then lastly, any final thoughts around that is, leadership's continued focus on profit maximization has got to be key, and any sort of headwinds that zero-based budgeting has faced historically, are now starting to go away. And probably the most important thing to call out here is there's some great advancements in technology that are out there, which are driving the business forward and making the FP&A function much stronger in the organization. And those things will help drive the zero-based budgeting aspect further into the business. Okay, thank you.
Paul, thank you so much for sharing your thought leadership. I already see that there are a lot of questions, but before we do this, we really would like to have another polling question to understand some feedback from you. So I'm about to open the next question and we will start voting very quickly. I'm launching the poll. I'm launching the poll right now. So please, can you start voting right now? Zero-based budgeting concept would become very important for the post-COVID FP&A. Do you agree with this statement or not? No, possible, yes, or I don't know. So please continue to vote. I can see that almost more than 50% of you voted, more than 60. Let us continue to 70 and more. And I'm about to close the poll and share the results with you. So those are the results. 2% of you think that no, it's not going to be really important after this post-COVID situation. 29% think possible, and 65% majority of you say yes, and 5% still don't know whether it will happen or not. Paul, any thoughts about this?
I'm actually very pleased to see an answer like that. I do think zero-based budgeting will be absolutely, in my personal view as a commercial finance leader, I personally believe that zero-based budgeting or zero-based planning will be very pivotal into the success of corporations going forward. So it's encouraging to see that majority of people are yes or possible.
Absolutely. So definitely everything what is happening with us right now, we need to look at zero base. And as somebody mentioned, the world is full of dead budgets and absolutely impossible forecasts. So we have to start from zero in many cases. I'm hiding the results, and this is the timing for quick conclusions. We always would like to share with you the why, the how approach. So what would be the practical approach in order to implement zero-based budgeting or zero-based planning or zero-based culture process in your company? So this is the 6-step approach from McKinsey. We looked at this approach at our FP&A board in Frankfurt, where we had presenter from this company. The first one, obviously, it's about developing visibility of your key items in your financial statements. The second one, link your resources to value. Exactly, identify key business drivers, key value drivers. Set the targets, it's important as well, realistic targets that are coming from your analytical exercise. A plan from zero, plan from scratch, play the scenarios. And of course, those items that could be removed comparing to your previous traditional budgeting process, reinvest them in those high priority items. And of course, monitor your success. And this is the never ending process, and this is the journey for all of us. So this is the conclusion, very good timing. As I said, we extended time a little bit for our Q&A session. And we already have some fantastic, interesting questions for Paul. The first one, Paul, interesting enough, we just discussed this. So people ask us that, should we be looking for new terminology for zero-based budgeting? For example, zero-based culture or zero-based mindset, because the using budgeting quote, the using budgeting word, it's not very popular at the moment. Budget absolutely not flexible and not value driven. It doesn't create value in the company. So what do you think, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely agree that the zero-based budgeting should be renamed to something a bit more, I'd say maybe a bit less financial. And there's two key reasons I call that. One is budgeting has been associated with finances for too long. And we need to kind of break that mold and make the ownership and a joint ownership between finance and the business to drive the profitability in the business. And zero-based budgeting kind of gets the connotation that it's an annual process. You cross it off the list, and then it's done. And it's something that finance needs because they need it as part of their job. And we want the business to kind of think about that. But last thing, I mean, now that I've left the multinationals and I'm working in a UK retailer, try to imagine if I had the annual budget that I created 6 months ago in today's world makes no sense whatsoever. Now, to create that budget, there was a tremendous amount of time, energy, and effort, a large amount of overtime, a fair amount of tears from people pulling it together, and the point of all that was for nothing, because all that work in today's world doesn't add any value to the business. What does add value to the business is understanding what the drivers are and being able to pivot up and down relatively quick and get an understanding of what your cost base are so that you can maximize or minimize your exposure in the current environment we're in. So I absolutely think that it needs to move away from budgeting into planning, into proper business engagement processes.
Thank you so much, Paul. I would like to add that the concept of driver-based mindset was already introduced by Accenture, and I think this is a great subject at the moment. This is how we should describe the process. This is zero-based mindset or zero-based culture. Another excellent question for you, Paul. Budgeting is done once in a year, while spending is done throughout the year. So what are your practical tips to integrate these two processes and to make zero-based spending as integral part of your operational strategy?
Yeah, so a couple of things to call out there, and it probably goes back to my words around the maturity of your FP&A team. You got to really assess that before you have a true answer. But if you have a mature FP&A team that's out there and you have business partners out in the field, then really you should be almost assessing every investment. You should be reviewing the results. And once again, I could talk to what I know now. Most of my life, I'm on a weekly review cycle in terms of reviewing the business. So on Monday mornings, what worked, what didn't work, how did we go through the business, and then what do we need to do to course correct and either maximize the opportunity or minimize the risk we're in. And then to make those decisions, you need to be aware of all the outputs from your zero-based budgeting initiative so you can understand the consequences of your decision. Now, in the retail world, that may be weekly. For other organizations, it would probably be much longer term, or it could even be shorter term on a daily basis, where project-based or not. But whatever your natural breaks are in the business, you should be reviewing your costs, checking how you're progressing against your strategy, and course correcting accordingly. I think the days of trying to bring those initiatives in line with the corporate budget timescales are going to be behind us soon.
Thank you so much, Paul. Another excellent question. What is the significant change in the budgeting process that was talked about? What does company change when implementing zero-based budgeting if they do traditional budgeting? And also, what are the 3-4 quick wins we can implement tomorrow?
So probably the biggest change is zero-based budgeting is looking at your costs from the ground up. So the justification of, and I'm going to pick on marketing only because it's a good example. I need 10% more marketing spend because our sales are growing at 20%, and last year I spent this much, so I need 10% more than last year. And that's the wrong way to look at it in terms of zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting needs to be about what delivered the most return on that investment. Where did I get the most value for that? Am I going to out-of-home advertising? Am I driving into digital? Am I going, and what is my strategy around that? Is it aligned to the product segmentation? Am I targeting the right customer groups? And then am I getting the best return from that as we go forward? And you're not referencing last year as a control point. Your control point is each individual investment in itself. Is it being assessed on its investment as it stands? I'm sorry, Larissa, there was 2 points to that question. What was the second part of that?
The second part, what does a company change when implementing ZBB if they do traditional budgeting? And also, what are the 3-4 quick wins if company wants to implement zero-based budgeting tomorrow?
Yeah, so I would probably start with the second half of that, and it would probably answer the first part in itself. So one is you need to have the right level of buy-off. So are you implementing zero-based budgeting across your entire company? Are you implementing it within a division of your company or within maybe a cost center? And that's probably critical in trying to understand. And each one of those can have great results, by the way. But you have to be clear about what it is you're going to do, and clear about what your desired outcome is going to be. One of the biggest fear factors would be is if you try to go and reassess every single spend without having the infrastructure in place to assess all your decisions that need to be made. The most important thing you can do is make sure you got executive buy-off on this. So you have time in the diaries with the leadership teams. They're aware about what they're going to pull together, and they understand the decision making that's going to need to happen in their court. I'll call out a good example. You know, when I was at Apple in my earlier days, we wanted to implement zero-based budgeting, and we kind of took an attempt at that. And you know, I went through with my business partner, and I was a business partner at the time, and we ripped through the P&L, went through the cost centers, we tried to get an understanding of what it's going to be, and we delivered these cost savings. And I thought I did a great job of saying, look, we can deliver the same results for a lot less costs, and here's what that means. But it transpires that, you know, other areas of the business didn't do as thorough a job, and as such, we ended up achieving for the division our company targets. But most of the cost savings were in my area because I was the one that kind of pushed that through, and that really soured the relationship with the business between finance and the business. So things that you have to make sure that you spend your time on getting it set up. The other side is really making sure you have the right tools in place to pull it through. So if you're going to use Excel, then make sure that you don't try to go into really granular level of detail to try to roll it out, because otherwise it will just fall over in itself. It'll be way too much detail to try to assess. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a great answer. The next one, what was the biggest challenge you faced when using zero-based budgeting?
For me, it's about trying to understand or trying to make sure we socialize that across the business. It's the politics thing more than anything else. So as a finance person, you can be grounded and understand what is meant by drivers of costs, and understand the link between the expenditure, and you can put a numbers-based case study together to make it happen. It's when the politics step in that, you know, the numbers kind of step out the window. And if you're in front of a business that's growing fast, sometimes numeric or cost-based decision making or decisions based off the numbers don't always hold true. So you have to make sure that, for me, that one of the biggest frustrations is trying to navigate the politics that are associated with the zero-based budgeting process.
Thank you so much. The next one, could you give a good reason to convince the company management to use zero-based budgeting?
Yeah, there's probably no other better reason than the world we're living in today. I go back to my comments I said earlier in the presentation. You got the coronavirus now, which has completely turned things upside down across no matter what business you're in. But before that, you had Brexit. You've got, you know, terrorist activities. You've got changing micro landscapes. You got significant advancements in technology, and so trying to use the traditional budgeting approach during an environment of such significant changes is very difficult to do, and probably will use a significant amount of time, energy, and effort and resource of your corporation for something that doesn't add a lot of value. Zero-based budgeting, or as I like to say, zero-based planning, will force you to understand your drivers, understand your costs, and maximize your investments.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. And we have more questions than we can answer, even after extending the Q&A session. But this one is going to be the last one. But obviously, you will have opportunity to connect with both of us on LinkedIn, and it would be wonderful to continue this conversation. So when implementing a zero-based budgeting, have you faced pushbacks, maybe from business partners who were so inclined to the traditional budgeting method? So how did you handle this?
Yeah, you do, and that probably goes back to my point about making sure you have buy-in from the top to implement that through. If you have a sales leader who is delivering phenomenal results in your organization and is adding a lot of value to your organization, and he doesn't or she doesn't buy into the need for zero-based budgeting, it's going to be difficult to bring them on board. So they got to understand what it is they're doing, why they're doing it, and what the benefit is around that. And so it is a function of the corporation you're in and the reasoning behind that. Now, in the retail world right now, where you're trying to cut costs and maximize your investments, it's quite easy to put a case study together to why you need to put zero-based budgeting, because the results will speak for itself. If I go back to the days of Apple, where you're growing your top line significantly, we were doubling, every year for a number of years. I mean, when I started at Apple, the revenue was about 3 billion in Europe. When I left, it was over 40, and so it was over a 10-year span. So if I was trying to implement zero-based budgeting at the company level there, it would be difficult to put it in place, because it would be hard to get people to get focused on trying to control your costs when we're trying to maximize the top line results. So the key is, for me, is to understand and communicate the benefits of what it is that the business will get out of it. If it's from just a finance perspective, it's going to be very difficult to sell that to the business.
Paul, thank you so much. This is the timing for us to close the Q&A session and to finalize. Just to remind you about our upcoming FP&A Board Connect sessions. The next one will be on the 13th of May. The stop will be in Dubai, zero-based budgeting case study. It will be from FP&A Director of Takeda. Then we will have predictive analytics and machine learning case from Paris. Then we will have FP&A business partnering from Seattle and also San Francisco. There will be 2 speakers, 2 FP&A board members. There will be FP&A analytical transformation case from Kuala Lumpur, and then a relevance of driver-based planning during uncertain time, the presentation from New York, and the second speaker will be from London. Also, you are welcome to join our full webinar, 1-hour webinar on collaborative planning with CFO of Coca-Cola, responsible for the global McDonald's division. So it's going to be great as well on the May 19th. We will send you all the links. Please continue to register, and it would be wonderful to have you as part of this project. And finally, I would like to say thank you so much to all of you for being part of this. Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your amazing experience with us. It's always a pleasure to meet you at FP&A boards, and thank you for being part of, for being such an active part of our FP&A community. And thank you so much to all our attendees, to all our participants. I'm about to close the webinar, and you will have opportunity to give your feedback. But please, if you can connect with with both of us, with Paul and me on LinkedIn, we would be happy to continue this conversation. And of course, if you have any ideas, any thought leadership, any interesting case studies, we are here for you. So please share this with us, because we are looking at best practice in financial planning and analysis. And all together, we are building FP&A trends around the globe. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. All the best, and see you on the 13th. Bye-bye.
Thank you.